Let me start with a disclaimer. Cool is completely subjective. The majority of this video is my personal take. Your take might be different, and you're welcome to politely share your opinions in the comments down below. None of this is empirical. The second part is, I'm not a skater boy, I'm not a streetwear collector, I'm not even cool. So I'm kind of on the outside. More or less, I'm a nerd who likes fashion, who wants to talk about it. That is the angle that I'm coming at this from. Today, I'm talking about Supreme, the cult skater brand that went from niche downtown secret to a globally recognized juggernaut, leading the charge of streetwear's rise to prominence. And going from underground to everyday comes with some growing pains. Supreme actually earnestly suffered from success. The brand's efforts to maintain exclusivity created a pressure cooker. The less people could get their hands on Supreme, the more they wanted it, to the point where the lines outside the tiny Lafayette location were daily, and the new pieces sold out immediately online for drop days. Supreme's public image has become less and less about the aesthetic of the brand or the pieces themselves, and instead the focus has become on how coveted the pieces were. Supreme's perception became this increasingly toxic cycle. A brand that often uses their logo as a parody became seen as the brands they were once mocking. Gaudy, ugly, commercial, and worst of all, uncool. To anyone paying attention to fashion in the last couple of years, the rise and fall of Supreme seems to be tied up or paired pretty closely with the rise and normalization of streetwear. I've heard several people tell me actually that they only got into fashion through Supreme. It was like their first brand, and that was the first thing they got excited about. And as they started to develop their taste, so to speak, they moved away from streetwear, moved away from Supreme. And at least for those people, I bet that definitely paints how they think of the brand today. Probably as something that they used to like, or something that was only an entryway for them to getting interested in fashion. But I don't think that tells the whole story. There was a time when either high or low, everybody was talking about Supreme. Even Rick attended the Paris launch party for Supreme's opening. It was a undeniably successful and buzzed about brand. Let's back it up a second for context. Let's actually talk about where it came from in order to make sense of whether or not it was cool or is now cool again. Supreme's founder, James Jebbia, set the stage for the cultural identity Supreme would have and the brand's eventual success. Moving from London,
this maths thing's a lot of bother,
to New York City,
fuck your life, bing bang.
Jebbia opened his first clothing store, Union, on Spring Street, focusing on streetwear and British brands. In time, Union experienced success and began selling skate brands like Stussy, a truly innovative label, and in many ways, the streetwear clothing brand. It's from a relationship that Jebbia developed while working directly with Sean Stussy himself that led to the creation of Supreme. When Sean Stussy retired from the game from designing clothing, Jebbia was faced with asking himself, what the hell am I going to do now? Which led him to open up the first Supreme store on Lafayette Street. Starting with t-shirts as the first Supreme branded products, Supreme soon evolved to creating more garments like hoodies, with the intent of making these pieces that felt a little better and fit a little better. Jebbia realized that the skater kids would pay a little bit more for a piece that was just right, for a hoodie or t-shirt that was just a little bit better than the competition. And he wanted to create a clothing store that avoided the big brands or the over-commercial feel that other retailers had. And just as important as the store itself, of course, New York City, was the neighborhood and vibe. Jebbia wanted to tap into that youthful energy into the culture and scene of downtown Manhattan during the 90s. This was a community and culture built on eclecticism, an appreciation for music, art, and movies from multiple genres. Writer for the cult New York City movie Kids, Harmony Korine, who lived in the neighborhood during the 90s, described early Supreme as they were early adapters to a kind of dissonance, where you have several things at different points on the cultural spectrum that are all connected by a kind of aesthetic or vibe. And this ethos was what Gebbia was channeling when the brand expanded into more products. This kind of open-minded and eclectic vision provides a good format for understanding how the brand evolved and the choices the team made with design. Supreme is constantly peering outward and showing its references from music to movies, art, and design collabs on its proverbial sleeve. And as the internet age caught up with Supreme, an appreciation for all things hip-hop, movies, art was shared by more than just New York City skaters. Having an internet eclectic taste is a staple of millennials and Zoomers who started to help make Supreme a hot brand. Their expansion was deliberate and restrained. Gebbia has explained that their branding and marketing was always calculated to appeal to young buyers who weren't interested in overly commercial brands, which is why in its early days, Supreme avoided any forms of traditional marketing. According to Vogue, it was 2012 when Supreme saw its first huge spike in popularity with their first Comme des Garçons collaboration. While Supreme had focused on collaborations since the 90s, it was the CDG collab that really opened up doors. As Gebbia said, I think it opened up a lot of doors. Oh wait, he said it, that's a quote. It's not hard to see why this type of collaboration would do that. CDG has been for decades a standard bearer of avant-garde fashion. More significant than Supreme's collaborations with artists, the Comme des Garçons collaboration showed that Supreme was being recognized by the likes of Rei Kawakubo as a legitimate fashion brand. In the following years, the hype around Supreme exploded, and Supreme's high watermark was probably around 2017 with the collaboration with Kim Jones and Louis Vuitton. And this wasn't just a high watermark for Supreme, but for streetwear in general. The blurring boundary between what is streetwear, what is low, and what is high fashion was being blurred pretty regularly up to this point. In November 2020, the Supreme brand was sold to fashion conglomerate VF, purchasing the brand from its original investors and Gebbia himself for $2.1 billion American. If anything might act as a strong signifier for where Supreme fell off, this is it. From this point, for all intents and purposes, Supreme was no longer cool.
I can't believe you've done this.
So in the first part of this video, I was essentially trying to argue where I think Supreme is right now in terms of public perception and essentially the history of it, how it became such a hyped brand and when it fell off. But a lot of that is still very vague, especially in terms of us defining or describing what cool is. Ultimately, cool is entirely subjective, like I said in the beginning of the video. I think that typically like-minded people will have similar opinions about what is cool or what isn't cool. But for the sake of this video and the sake of argument, I have 3 qualities that I think typically define something as being cool.
Damn, son, where'd you find this?
So the first one being novel. I think any kind of artist or brand, if it wants to be cool, needs to be novel in some way. It has to have some kind of newness. I think this is one of the most important qualities of anything that we typically think is cool. It has to have something new or bring something unique to the table that we're unfamiliar with. The other quality being nostalgic. Everything that anybody makes is on the back acts of culture that has come before it. Our language, our ideas about art, our ideas about clothes, our ideas about what a skateboard is. Everything comes from something else. And I believe that cool things usually have a close tie to nostalgia. Nostalgia, I think, often embeds a sense of familiarity. It imbues a sense of authenticity, being tied to something that came before it, being tied to something that is more established and understood. Last one, effortlessness. I'm sure if I asked you to be cool, you would probably be very nonchalant. You would probably be all apathetic and put on a pair of sunglasses and stuff like that. That's kind of like a stereotypical way to act cool. And I think that it translates into a sense of effortlessness that I think cool things typically have. Effortlessness is often seen, or I guess acted out, as not attempting to be liked or to be praised. It's being something of confident in yourself, and it's acting confident, acting effortless. Effortlessness can be like grace, like unstrained elegance, like the grace of a dancer. And with those three qualities in mind, those are what I think are kind of internal. Those are things that a brand or an artist are doing or choosing for themselves. It's something they have agency over. But typically, anything being perceived as cool has external factors. There are reasons that we as a group or people might think something is cool or uncool based on how we perceive it and how other people perceive it. Very popular things can be cool. I would argue that brands like Nike are both very popular and considered by most people to be cool. But often coolness kind of has an antithetical thing where if something becomes too popular, if it's too saturated in our culture, or even if like the fan base is too obnoxious as a result of growing so big, we can often have kind of like a reverse effect. We start thinking that really popular thing is uncool. Bruh. Ultimately, we can control what we do. We can't control what other people do or think. But I still think that it is involved in defining coolness, perceiving coolness. So let's just talk about old Supreme. How does that older Supreme I described earlier fit into like those three qualities I just lined out?
Supreme was undeniably novel. It not only established a lot of what a streetwear brand would be, but its business model has been emulated and ripped off by various other companies. It helped define and codify what streetwear would focus on with t-shirts and hoodies, and it was undeniably novel in the way that it dealt with collaborations, which have now become a mainstay for so many different brands in so many different industries. Supreme just did it very different. In terms of nostalgia, the early days of Supreme were deeply rooted in all of the cultural touchstones and references that defined a lot of New York culture at the time and would define Supreme. From hip-hop to music and art, like I mentioned before, these were deeply ingrained in Supreme's DNA. We still see it today, but it definitely carries that nostalgic element like I described earlier. Lastly, with effortlessness, Supreme had this in spades. They've always gone out of their way to not go out of their way. Take, for example, this quote from a GQ article talking about the history of Supreme. The original Supreme store in 1994 was described as such. There was a crazy energy around the store. It didn't feel like a shop because they definitely didn't want to sell you anything. Maybe they didn't even want you in the store. While these qualities might both sound rude and antithetical to running a brand, they demonstrate Supreme's focus on its core audience, its focus to show that it is uninterested in trying to cater to other people outside of this culture. And whether or not this was contrived, it definitely demonstrated a sense of effortlessness. They did not seem like they were catering to you.
So at this point, you're probably like, all right.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
You think Supreme was cool, But I still have the question from the thumbnail. Is Supreme cool now? Please tell me. And I will do so by starting with kind of what inspired me to make this video in the first place. Maybe a month or two ago, I was in Williamsburg and I happened to be close to the new Supreme Williamsburg store, so I tried to go in. And for the first time in years, I was able to just walk into a Supreme store. It was basically empty. I had access to all sorts of garments and goods, and it made me start to think that, in my mind, at least just looking at those current circumstances, Supreme is a lot less popular, it seems, than it was in the past. It definitely is a lot less popular in fashion circles than it once was. And that ties into kind of the fourth quality that I mentioned, the three things that you control with being cool, and then the one that you don't control, which is your popularity. And how your popularity sometimes warps how people think about your coolness. And typically, if you're unpopular, if it's not something that a lot of people are talking about, if it's not necessarily mainstream, typically you have a lot of better chance of being considered cool just because it is different. It's more subversive if it's not something everyone is talking about. And it made me think that a lot of the hype has died down, at least just in the circles that I follow on social media. I barely see anyone talking about Supreme. But a lot of the core tenets that made the brand interesting in the past, I think are still here. I think that ultimately it's still the streetwear brand that it once was. It makes clothes that for the price are pretty good. They are usually made well, and there's a lot of stuff that are low-key flexes. But there's also a lot of designs that are wacko, that are crazy and goofy, and that's fun. I mean, look at some of the pieces that I scrolled through with the GQ article. There are a lot of designs that are completely out there, and I think that deserves props. And for what it's worth, I think the recent collaborations that Supreme has had have been very cool. They are, I think, fashion. And those include the ones that they've done with Yohji Yamamoto. And the ones they've done with Jean-Paul Gaultier. I think the pieces that they produced for those collaborations look dope. They look relevant for both brands. It doesn't seem like one is overpowering the other. They look like what is supposed to be exciting and cool about Supreme, about bringing this obscure or high quality avant-garde fashion brand, combining it with this low-key, really straightforward streetwear aesthetic and making garments in a special collection. I still think that that is cool. I think that is interesting. And ultimately, I think the one quality that maybe you would argue, my door just opened. I think maybe you might concede to me that yeah, Supreme is still novel in terms of it has interesting designs, it has an interesting value proposition, so to speak, it does cool collaborations. Maybe you would concede to me that yes, it still has those roots in being nostalgic, it still constantly references music, art, culture, it still does these types of things that kind of pull culture from the past. Debatable of whether or not you like that, but maybe you would say Supreme is no longer effortless. Supreme was purchased by VF, a huge conglomerate. It was a $2 billion sale, and it's going to be a sellout now. It is now a sellout. It's gonna expand further, it's gonna market further, it's gonna do all those things that make it seem effortful and not effortless. To which I would say, maybe. I think that ultimately, you can't really blame Supreme for the sale in general. I don't think that that's something that they could really change the course of, because we live in a capitalist society, because Supreme was a brand, because initially there's no way that James Jebbia could realistically grow a brand with just the money in his pocket, so they had to have investors. And realistically, investors are like, listen, dude, I need to, or I want to, make a return on my investment. So when the opportunity comes that somebody is actually willing to pay a lot of money for the brand, it's not really up to you to turn that down. I imagine Jebbia and the rest of the leadership would realistically have to say, either we sell the brand so that our investors are happy and we kind of can keep our promise, which we have to, or they would be forced to grow and develop the brand to such a further degree that it would have to dilute everything that is special about it in order to keep good with those investment promises. The long story short of it is the sellout to VF. If you think that's lame, if you think that they're sellouts just for doing that, I think you should ask yourself whether or not a capitalist society allows that kind of authenticity, if that's even like an option for anyone, because I would argue it's not. It was a brand, it had to have investors to grow, ultimately it has to sell it off. I guess the TLDR is, okay, so it is sold off to VF, it is no longer an independent label. When is it gonna start to become corny and lame? And I think like one of the best comparisons would be like Maison Margiela. So when Margiela started the brand and their initial stores and their initial like everything was extremely low key. The tags literally didn't have anything on them, and the stores were legitimately secrets. They were placed in obscure parts of like Paris and New York. They had minimal signage. They were for only people who were in the know. But ultimately, Margiela did get purchased by a large conglomerate. Ultimately, a controlling group said that this company needs to become more profitable. And as a result, Margiela started doing things that were more commercial. They started making a fragrance line, which is very much a capitalist venture. That is a brand trying to sell a little bit of itself, a little bit of its mystique for an affordable price through perfume in a Sephora in your local mall. And they've done more to kind of make themselves more visible. Like their most recent store in Soho is not off the beaten path. It is directly across the street from the Rick Owens store. It has signage, it is obvious, it wants foot traffic, it wants to be noticed. So Margiela is at least an example of a brand that was once very obscure, not well known, deliberately so, that was purchased by a bigger brand and has now become slowly more commercial. I would say, while I would argue that probably a lot of the things they do are taking away from the je ne sais quoi of what makes Margiela interesting, I don't think the brand has completely lost step. I like their fragrances. I like how they smell. I like how they did it. I like that Margiela continues to make clothing. I like that it continues to make itself accessible instead of completely inaccessible. I think that while it might be, something that's not totally in line with the brand, it hasn't produced complete garbage, and Margiela isn't in the trash as a result. And I think that if we use that kind of metaphor or comparison for Supreme, as long as VF continues to kind of drive this boat that is Supreme in a way that is authentic or real to the brand, we could hope to see something similar. Maybe Supreme will expand more. Maybe they might do things that are slightly more commercial. But if it's like how Margiela was handled, maybe it won't completely lose the essence of the brand. And, that is a speculation. But I think ultimately, right now, Supreme is a buy. It's a stock that you should buy into. It's a brand that nobody seems to care about right now, especially in like the high fashion space, but I think it's as cool as it was. If anything, maybe it's cooler now that people expect it to be lame. Maybe now it's cooler because people expect it to be lame, but it still has the same like subversive, fuck you attitude, and continues to do interesting collaborations. It continues to exist, and it will benefit from becoming low key. There is maybe a universe where this like growth spurt and kind of collapse, so to speak, like this huge hype train that led to a downfall was all to Supreme's benefit. Maybe ultimately they had to shed that global appeal. They had to shed that like massive level of hype so that they could once again kind of hunker down, focus on what they do best, and begin to cater only to the diehard fans who were interested in them for reasons other than just hype. If that's the truth, if that holds true, then yes, I think Supreme might be cool again. But you know, whatever. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Be nice. And I hope to see some either good pros or cons. And as always, I want to remind you guys, I do a live stream every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Killian. We run this podcast called The Biased Cut. The link will be down below. I would love to see you guys attend. I would love to see you guys in the stream, commenting, getting involved. It's just like a hang. It's like we just kind of riff on things that are happening in fashion. I kind of just goof off. And it's a lot of fun when we get people commenting because we're like asking you questions. We're engaging with you. Maybe you want to complain about this Supreme video. The best place to do it would be during that live stream. You have my undivided attention. And that's it. Hope you liked the video. If you did, leave it a like. If you're new, subscribe and comment. And yeah, I'll catch you later.
Fuck your life, bing bang.
Take care.